And it's a very good afternoon to the Sportsfan radio panel, and very special guest with us today, Cameron Schwab. Cameron, you were with us back in October 2020. There's a lot of water gone under the bridge since then, including one of my favourite teams winning a premiership. How has that 18 months been going for you?
It's been a big 18 months, I think. It feels like about 3 months in some ways, but it's I've had a fair bit going on. I've actually moved up to the country. I'm living in Dalesford now, right opposite the old Dalesford footy ground, the home of Chris Grant. Was there probably the favourite son from. It was one of the oldest footy clubs, because it was all gold mining country up here, and so the footy club, you're going to form a town, you've got to form a footy club pretty quickly, and so that, and I've also had cancer, so that's actually been something I've had to work through. But I've come out the other end of that hopefully okay, and enjoyed watching the Demons win their premiership, and I particularly enjoyed, I must admit, the fact that they, almost from the very first moment Max Gawn and anyone else was talked about, they sort of brought in what it meant beyond them. It was all about, it was Barassi, it was Neil Danaher, it was, all those who'd sort of gone before. And I'd like to think that we played a bit of a role in all of that, because we always try to induct our people and our players on, so they understand not just what it means for them, but what it means for those who have gone before and those who have identified with the club throughout their whole lives. So I enjoyed that. I enjoyed watching the D's have a win. They give me the best and the worst of my times, I've got to say, in sport, the mighty Demons, so yeah.
I've got to say, sorry, I'll jump in as a Rabbitohs man. It wasn't that long ago, one of my best mates and I would joke at the start of the season, we'll put on a Rabbitohs and Demons multi, and then we'll retire when we win. And we wouldn't have had to invest that much, but it actually wasn't that far back, and we've each done it. So did you actually think it would happen so soon? Oh, when it happened?
No, one thing, it's interesting, because I'm obviously give it a lot of thought when it happens, but it's interesting that just that process of any team which actually, I can only speak about the ones where I have a more insight into. So I know the Rabbitohs from a distance, not so much the day-to-day, but Melbourne made the finals in 2018 and probably were, they won their way through and then won two finals well, then got thrashed in the third, and then really dropped away and had a promising season the year before. But majority of teams, as they grow, will have disappointing seasons on their pathway to success. And I think it's mainly, because one of the most underestimated aspects of, particularly, the AFL team environment is a little bit unique in that we've actually got, they're big squads for a start, and there are, and you've actually got 18 players playing out on the ground at any one time. So there's a lot of human interaction going on, and so the shared experience and teams growing up together is perhaps the most underestimated aspect of team sport. And there's a lot of ratings and numbers now which go into words like cohesion, the amount of time players have actually spent playing together. And most of that relates to, that they've had times where they've failed. They've had times where they've woken up in the morning thinking, will this ever happen? They've been described as being disappointing. All the things that Melbourne have had to go through, even in this team's life, are all reasons why they're now good. And if you come out the other end of that, where you're a really strong club, and if you even think about Richmond had that experience, they were disappointing for a period, then had a poor season. The coach is under scrutiny, and then they win 3 of the next 4 premierships. Geelong with Mark Thompson went through that period. So I think there's always a depth of disappointment along the way, even in the. And that's not taking into account the fact there's been about 15 generations of players before this group who've all gone through that. So there's elements inside that which I think get underestimated. And one of the interesting clubs this year on that basis would be Essendon, because there's high expectations around their improved performance this year, but they haven't gone through that as a group yet. So perhaps yeah, they might have a good season, but it might necessarily mean that they're good enough to go on and win it. And I noticed Mick Malthouse has got them as one of the clubs that he thinks will do well, which I think they should. But this group haven't gone through it in their own right. They've had a lot of disappointments way back there, but they're coming together because it's a relatively young group as it plays out now. So it'd be interesting to watch. And I think the Demons are really well positioned. They also had an extraordinary run with injuries. They hardly lost a player all year. And as much as we like to think, oh, we should be able to overcome that, but if you have 4 or 5 key injuries to key players, that pretty much puts a hole in your season.
Cameron, we got you back because you're one of the more interesting guests we've had, and you talk about things that others don't talk about, particularly the mainstream media. I'm fascinated by the concept that for a side to succeed, it has to have disappointing seasons. Now, you just never hear about that. Disappointing suggests poor, low morale. The coach gets put under scrutiny, which just drives me nuts every year. Yeah. The media get in their normal pack mentality. They jump on that team and demonise the team. The sponsors start to get a bit nervous. The supporters get a bit nervous. I'm a St Kilda tragic. So, of course, disappointing seasons. I mean, we've lived at disappointing for 150 years.
I came into this world as a St Kilda supporter. You know that?
Well, go out as St Kilda supporter now. You've had your premiership.
No, I did. Because my father, Alan Schwab, was assistant secretary to Ian Drake. I was born in December 1973, and he just started at St Kilda. And so my first little jumper number was a woolly little St Kilda jumper with number 5 on the back, Ian Stewart. And probably part of the irony of that was that my father did the deal to swap Ian Stewart for Billy Barrett years later. So I've got to say,
tell us why a club like St Kilda shouldn't be afraid of disappointing seasons, because God knows we've had some, and we've had some remarkable teams and close runs. But why do you say disappointing seasons can be the springboard to something greater?
I think it's like any form of disappointment. There's if you think about most of the growth period of your life, it's when you've had to actually face into some form of disappointment at some stage. I was reading even a book, and I never thought this guy would be one of my leadership inspirations, but it was a book by Matthew McConaughey, the actor, and the book's called Green Lights, and it's quite a beautiful book, actually. And one of the reasons it's a good book is that he's actually kept journal since he was about 14. So his memory of things isn't just like pressing some button in your head, some CD player or DVD player in your head, but he actually looks at what he wrote down when he was. So, and you tend to go, when you go through difficult periods, you tend to go deeper in that, just by human nature in that sense. And so he's got this line, and I'll lighten it up. I won't drop the F-bomb because I know that's probably inappropriate. But he basically says, he says there are angels of truth everywhere. There are angels of wisdom everywhere. We only tend to access them when we're stuffed, And so what happens in sport is that the world lives in a world of quite a binary world, of heroes and villains and black and white, good and bad. But the reality of sport is that it's very nuanced, it's very ambiguous, and that's where leadership's most tested. And that's why coaches during those times are the ones who find themselves under scrutiny, because they're ultimately the people more than any other who have their hands on the levers. There's obviously a lot of levers and a lot of hands on those levers, but more than anyone else. And so even the assessment of coaches is very binary. They're either this or they're that. Well, it's never really, in my experience, it's never that. And you're always experimenting. You're always trying different things. And it's not like it's not an exact science, this thing. You're putting a potpourri of people together for the very first time who have to actually work out, there's sort of 3 dimensions to any team environment. And the first one is that people know their role. The second part is people accept their role. And the third part is that people play their role. And in any environment where you've got a lot of players and a lot of people activating in that, there's a lot of stuff that can go wrong in that. And so the experience of having gone through difficult times, had the hard conversations, sorted each other out, even let go of a few of the people who you thought were going to be part of the plan, along the way, because they haven't reached the standards or they're not prepared to be the team players or the role players that you wanted them to be, is all part of the natural growth of the team. And the St Kilda exercise is interesting because they've tried to shortcut it a little bit, by going for some more experienced players, and that's always, I think there's always going to be a time and a place for that. But for me, it just sensed that it went a bit earlier than what I thought it would have. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm just saying that's how it's happened. But even when you bring experienced players in, there still is a part of it where people have to grow together, even if they're doing the growing together at 25, 26 years of age rather than 18 or 19 years of age. So I think from the Saints' point of view, the disappointing year, there's a really good opportunity for them because there was promise, obviously, the previous year, and then you've got the disappointment of last year, the analysis which then goes into it, and the sorts of conversations which coaches, players, people in and around the club would have had would be really important at this point, and I think they're one of the interests. If you're looking at and you're probably from a Saints supporter's point of view thinking, well, I've been looking at it in this way forever, but from an outside looking in perspective, I would say they're perhaps the most, them and Essendon, I think, are the two interesting teams of 2022.
There's a Chinese curse, Cameron. May you live in interesting times. I've been living in interesting times since 1966, and I'm sick of being interesting. I want to be successful.
You went pretty close, and so you probably, obviously you're a bounce of the ball away from winning one, and you hold on to that group and you try and get the best from it. Then it got a bit messy for a while, but it seems to me that it's trying to build on the right stuff now. But there's some very good sides in it. I think that's the other aspect to St Kilda's development. Like the Western Bulldogs are going to be really interesting as well, I think, because they're coming on.
If I just take you back to Matthew McConaughey, he's quite a salesman. He can sell a bourbon he doesn't even drink. Wild turkey doesn't drink bourbon. He can sell a cage to a lion, that bloke.
Yeah, well, he's got good genetics, hasn't he? Like he's ridiculously handsome, and he's got the beautiful Texan drawl, and she's a fair package. One of the interesting stories about his book is his parents got married 3 times to each other. So they like, it wasn't they didn't get married; they got married 3 times, which is probably not all that surprising in life these days. But they got married 3 times to each other. So they broke up, got married, broke up, got married. Yeah.
No danger in this corner, panel, before you ask. Anyway, that's another story.
Yeah, so the Saints. I'll be very interested to see how they go, and I would also say that for all the you cop this a lot because the teams I went to were clubs who hadn't had success for a long time. So you often, one of the things you're feeling the weight of is the disappointment of people who have barracked for a club their whole life and haven't seen them win. You felt that, but you couldn't short term your plans because of that. Each group has to go through its own evolution, its own development. You can't put the old head on young shoulders scenario. But what you're always hoping that you're building it around is 3 or 4 really good, interesting, solid citizens, leaders, and the one thing which I say with Melbourne, with the evolution of Max Gawn, is that he's a wonderful leader, but he leads in a way which is just a full expression of who he is as well. So you're getting a bit of the quirkiness and the colour and all the stuff which actually goes with it. And also he has a deep respect for someone who didn't grow up with the game the same way as most did, because his parents are from New Zealand, and I think they eloped actually to Australia. That's how they got here. He didn't grow up with it in the same way as, say, most of us did. And but he's become he's almost the modern type leader in lots of ways, that he's not scared to be who he is. And if a few people get a bit jumpy with that, or it's not classical, it's not whatever, well, that would have puts him under a little bit more pressure. But if you come out the end of it like he has as a premiership captain, they've got something really special there. And there's a wonderful complement between him and Jack Viney, who's just really, tunnelled in terms of his determination. And so they've got a good mix, got a really good mix.
Cameron, I was going to mention about Jack Viney. is that over the last few years, obviously Jack had been captain of the footy club, the player vote, and obviously the behind the scenes deemed Max Gawn to be the sole captain. And at the end of the day, it is a demotion from captain to vice captain for Jack Vining. But the character of that particular individual, I think, has shone through. Yeah. And he's also a significant reason why the footy club is where it is. And going back to your comment before about past players, the day that Melbourne celebrated at the MCG, I think as a footy club, we have been splintered. We have had our issues off the field and whatever it be. But when you see 50 to 60 ex-past players of the footy club walk down the stands with 5 minutes to go of the replay, and no one's watching the replay at this stage, all they're doing is watching the past players walk down. And so you can roll the names off it was just the who's who of the Melbourne Footy Club. And I think that meant as much to the spectators and the members and the diehards as the Premiership Cup being brought out.
Yeah. Yeah. And so it should, I reckon, because there were generations, because a lot of those past players were as good as the blokes who are running around for Melbourne now. They just didn't, for whatever reason, they tried but didn't quite get there. In some cases, got pretty close. And Melbourne's always a challenging environment because it was strategically had its disadvantages. Clearly had some advantages. It was a great club for a long time, but one of the reasons it was a great club was it strategically had advantages in that it was the only club playing out of the MCG for a long period of time. So there's a guy, Jimmy Cardwell, who was the Prince of Secretaries, he could go around the whole of Australia and say, well, if you get to play, you're going to play in the MCG. It was a pretty big, ticket to throw it, to put on the table, and it wasn't until Graham Richmond and Jack Dyer, when they got Richmond over to the MCG, not only threw that ticket on the table, but probably they threw a Gladstone bag of £1 notes in the air and said, son, you better sign before the last one hits the ground. So that's, that was part of the, and so Melbourne lost its competitive advantage in 1965, and other stuff happens as well. The club dislocated, Norm Smith sacked, all that stuff. Brassey goes to Carlton. And so it lost its strategic advantage and sort of, in my mind, for a long time, still try to play to that. And then you've got to remember, Melbourne almost goes out of business about 4 times during that period. So, and if you happen to be a player in that, and it's just luck, really, with all of that going on in the background, and, the chances are you're not going to play in a premiership side. That's just the reality. So if you're Rodney Grinter, for instance, who's a wonderful person in the former players now, well, Rodney Grinter's good enough to play in the Melbourne side now at the peak of his powers. It would have been tight, I'd say, but he was a very good player in very good sides, And the Melbourne sides which get beaten in, say, the late 80s, early 90s, they're coming against Hawthorn, who's one of the greatest ever sides. And then the emergence of Carlton, who's one of the, they were great. They were hard sides to beat. And so winning it is not just your team being good enough, but it's depending on who else is around. And I think St Kilda were very unlucky from that point of view, because not only, they're a good side, but they've got really good sides they're trying to beat. They're competing mainly with Geelong during that period, which is one of the all-time great sides, and Collingwood, who perhaps could have snuck one or two more as well. So, and then Hawthorn come through not long after, or around that time. So you've got to beat whoever's there as well. And so a lot of those Melbourne people, they feel deeply, because I'm close to a lot of those guys, because I recruited the first group. I was involved in the recruitment of, the generation of the late 80s, early 90s, and then came back, and then it was the next group, Woe Woden, that Liancelli, that sort of group around that time, Jeff White, Stephen Tingay, Nietzsche, Schwartzy, those sorts of players. And then even the more recent group, of which, and both for me, both of those end up not in great circumstance, clearly. And I would have definitely gone. I didn't actually go, but my daughter got married that day. So I wouldn't have been in, and I was walking her down the aisle. So, if you hadn't asked me to walk down the aisle, so I hope this is not going anywhere, is it? No, I couldn't. I definitely, but I was genuine. And the wonderful thing, because there was a deal we put together in around 2002 10, 11, which netted the club around $25 million, which they got to pay out this year.
Yep.
And so that sort of sets the club up forever, really, doesn't it? $25 million, you know. And I got a little call from Gary Pert just thanking, and it seems weird that a bloke, I've been around it for a long time, but God, that little phone call meant a lot to me, you know. And it was just, and it was a chat and it was a talk. It wasn't just a token sort of thank. We sat on the phone and we talked about, because we were sort of, he was at Collingwood, I was at Melbourne. We've known each other for a long time. I remember him coming through and just to get a look, because I knew at the time it was a game changer, but I was out of the club 2 years later. So $25 million now and silverware they've now had. So 2021 really, in many ways, can set the Melbourne Football Club up for the next.
And Cam, I was very fortunate growing up. I played tennis with Gary Hardiman. And
yeah, beautiful man, Gaz. Yeah.
He used to look after me on court when things probably went a little bit awry as a 17, 18-year-old. But Gaz, obviously, on the day was very popular because he was our best player for that era. Like,
he was a really good player too. Like, I always remember there was a debate at the start, you know, the preseason debate, and one of the Melbourne question always was, does Gary Hardiman play centre half forward and centre half or centre half back? And when you meet Gary's only about 6'1", I reckon. Yeah. Might even be that. And they thought, oh, Melbourne might be good enough, as in we might be able to cover him back, you know, so he might be able to play. He might be able to play forward this year, and we'll be a good side. But by about round 3, he's back at centre half back every year because the Demons were no good, and he's watching the ball go over. He said, I reckon he come second or third in the Brownlow one year. Gary Hardy
came second in the Brownlow, but it was interesting because I'm there with my brother and my 2 nephews who are 11 and 9, and they've never met him.
Yeah,
and Chris, my brother's a bit taller than me. So Chris is about 6'2", 6'3". So Chris is taller than Gary.
Yeah.
And to tell these kids, and this is the interesting thing about the evolution of our game, is Gary was one of the best centre-half backs in the competition, whereas now he's not even a starting midfielder with his height.
But he would have played there. But he definitely would have played there. So I've got Royce Hart's lace up here. That's that jumper there. Mate, Royce is only about 6'1", you know. And probably only just that, I reckon, as well. I mean, when you meet Dermot, he's not that tall. There are certain players who you know can play in. But I remember at Freo, we recruited David Mundy as a full back.
Wow.
And he ended up being one of the elite midfielders. David Mundy, he'd be close to 6'4", I reckon, 6'3.5", 6'4", in the old language. Don't we? We're us old timers here. There's no centimetres amongst us, you know. Yeah. The funny thing is, you always say that they're. I use the old to measure height, but the new to measure weight. You know, like he's 6 foot and 83 kilos. You sort of you mix them up.
You got a foot in each camp.
13 stone 2 or something like that. You don't say that.
And Cam, one of the things I think, like from afar, and obviously we get snippets through the media and all the like, and I mentioned this to Mark, was that over the last sort of 5 to 6 years, and it hasn't immediately happened, but I think the connection between your president, your CEO, and coach has never been more prevalent. It's never been more important for externally looking, because all of a sudden you look at Richmond, and what you mentioned before about the fact that Hardwick was nearly gone. There was this faction that wanted to take over, come in, sack people, bring Neil Barn, whatever it was. And then, as you said, from there, they've gone on and won 3 premierships out of 4. Yeah. They're financially successful. They're a destination club, and they've got the women's team up and going now, and they are aiming for 100,000 members.
Yeah.
So Melbourne, if you look at Melbourne, I think they've gone on the right track. And obviously, previously, the transition between presidents during the year would have created more of a headline from Bartlett through to Rofi. Yeah. But that was just seamless, and the football team on field was pretty helpful.
I don't think it was that seamless, but certainly felt like it from the outside.
From the outside, certainly from the outside. But you look at John, who's St Kilda, and you start talking about that club, and they seem to have this instability for several years. Now, at the moment, John, and you know better than me because they've done a few 5-year plans, and they haven't quite cracked New Zealand yet, I think. I'm not sure, but are they still trying, John?
I think that ship sailed. I think China's the next place on their horizon. It's a little bit bigger, apparently, and the numbers stack up if you get 1% of the population, all that sort of stuff. I couldn't agree more. The St Kilda took itself into the wilderness and just got lost there for a few years. I was going to ask Cam, because I think this comes out from what you're saying. Financial stability of a club is huge. If you've got that kanga in the bank, you know that you can afford psychologists and you can afford the add-ons that you need. It must give you a lot of confidence in your club.
Yeah, no, it does. Look, it's important, but generally, if you go no good, you go no good at both. That would be my take. So you're not. So, for instance, Melbourne strategically, as I mentioned before, is a really tight model. Like it plays at the MCG, which is wonderful. There's no doubt about that. But there's no competitive advantage in playing at the MCG. So you're not playing with advantage at any time. So when I was at Fremantle, for instance, we would play with disadvantage when we played away. But there's no doubt you played with advantage at home. So if you could actually win your 9, 10, or 11 at home out of your 12, which is a possibility if you're a good side. Well, you then only have to win 2 or 3 away, and you're quite well positioned. But winning 2 or 3 away is really hard, and that's often a bit of a definer when the interstate club starts to do that, particularly the Perth-based teams, because it's harder again. So Melbourne in that situation, there's no supply demand issues at the MCG. Like you can turn up anytime and go to a game. So there's no margin you can then charge on tickets. You got 33% of Melbourne supporter base are MCC members. So you've there got 33% of your memberships is MCC members. So and 33% of I think it might even be below that. 25% of the MCC membership in total are Melbourne Football Club supporters. We have no reason to act. So that kills your economics almost straight away. The advantage that they've got is that it's a relatively wealthier base. But not many people just write out a check for $500 and give it to them. There's got to be a reason why you pay money. You also had Collingwood, Hawthorn. You had these clubs who were going really well, playing at the MCG as well. Richmond, obviously, who are much bigger club. Hawthorn have become a little bit that not a massive club, Hawthorn, but certainly at least mid-tier. And they've won 10 premierships in the life of most people who barrack for their footy club too. So that's
and we know that, please. We know.
So all of these
remind us that
all of these factors come into play. So Melbourne, for all its advantage, and there's also no suburb of Melbourne, so identity actually becomes a little bit of an issue for them. So it was always a strategically challenging club to get right, but you always felt that if you got it right, there was enough there to build momentum in its own way. But it had to come up with ideas and thoughts which are a bit unique. So actually China was one of the things that Melbourne had a real go at, and were the first club to do that, playing games in the Northern Territory, all the ways to actually grow something which was that. But probably the biggest decision we made during that period was to actually recognise that the game, if it's going to be serious about its conversation with women, can we at least create a career path for women to play the game? And so Melbourne were the first club to take that step. And that was actually born out of, for all of the want for a greater good and we want equality and all that, there clearly was a really strong argument around that. But it was an opportunity to say, well, how do we position ourselves as a club which is different? Because Melbourne actually, if anyone can claim the old boys feel, really it's Melbourne as much as any. People weren't allowed in the MCC itself. You couldn't be a female member until John Cain in the early 80s. So it was actually seen as very male, but it was actually the club which was the male-dominated club, in fact, was the one which created the vision for women's football, which I now think is perhaps the most powerful and significant change the game's actually seen in the last, I reckon, maybe ever, to be honest.
And would you agree that Debbie Lee should have the medal named after her?
Oh, if you're going to name it after anyone, I think that. Well, she hasn't found her way into the AFL Hall of Fame as the first female player for no reason. No, and she was a part of the inspiration because she was coming into work each Monday morning, and I'd chat to her and talk about the games, and then she got me to come to some of the games. I really enjoyed them, and then one year she was like president of the league. I think she might have even been coach of her team. She certainly was still playing. She played 300 games and she was limping in because she partially torn her anterior cruciate ligament, was still playing on it. And I'm talking the most committed football person in my entire life, who spent majority of her love of the game being mocked by people who, and so no aspect of my love of the game or our love of the game has ever been mocked. It's only ever been encouraged. People have told me I'm no good. I get that, but that's okay. That's just part of the deal. But I've never been mocked for loving it. Well, she had been. And so all we basically did is we decided to play a country versus city game at the MCG. And myself and David Parkin were the speakers before the night before with this event. And all of the athletes would come over and have a chat, and they'd all tell their own stories as to why they were playing football. And the majority of them had been Auskick kids who then stopped playing, played other sports, and were coming back to the game. And so there was a gap there. And so we played the game. The game was terrific because it took a lot of convincing to do it, but we played it at the MCG. But it was played a long time before the senior game, because you used to have the gap and between games, and so hardly anyone saw it. But straight away, it was when sometimes you have sort of like almost a visceral feeling about something, when you're watching it, and it was. So the thought was straight away, sit in the stands. Why doesn't Melbourne be the first club? We're the oldest club. Why don't we become the first club to have a women's team? And that was the decision. And he said, we've got to have a draft. The key is to have a draft, because then we get to nominate players, and those players become the household names the minute you're called up as the best players. And it's a unique draft because it is everyone's in it. It's not just the best young players are in it. Everyone's in this draft. Well, number one player is Daisy Pearce. And like her career since has been extraordinary. And we then had to try and convince someone to play us, and we couldn't find anyone to play us. No, we ran clubs up. No one wanted to play us in this game. And eventually it was the Western Bulldogs, because they had all their own issues they were trying to deal with at the time as well. But because Melbourne and the Western Bulldogs had done the Pink Lady games, with the breast cancer on the ground, that we felt that we were the two clubs who had the right to it, if you like. We'd done our work in regard to that. And so 2013 is the first exhibition game between two AFL clubs, and the AFL are watching it. And, I think a lot of us, as part of, even as CEOs in sport, our job is just to take the conversation forward if we can, knowing that it's going to take someone else to take it further forward. And so, and even in taking it forward, that perhaps when it goes all the way forward, you're sort of the forgotten person back there. That's just part of the deal. And that's changed women's football, because from that point onwards, girls started playing. You can't be what you can't see. Girls want to play the game. Even around here, the Dalesford Footy Club, they had their whole facilities rebuilt on the basis that they now had to cater for men and women. And so the amount of funding that's actually brought into, like even a small club like this one, who are really important inside the community, is because they've got to cater for girls. There's a girls team in Hepburn. There's a girls team at Dalesford, because of that exhibition game. That's how it came about.
Cam, both Mark and myself obviously have been involved at the Southern Footy League, and they've now got a women's competition, and we're very fortunate to have some board members that really had this passion for having played it, but also seeing the impact it can have on player and the girls. And
their parents as well, because often men had been lost to the game because they had their girls, and so now their girls have come back. So the men are coming back to the game as team managers, coaches, doing all the things that they wouldn't have otherwise had the opportunity of doing.
And their club, and they go back to the club and their club legends, and all of a sudden they're reconnecting with the mates that they played with, and their girls are getting to see what a football club is like. Yeah. And the facilities was the biggest one. So say, for instance, Bayside started doing ground facilities to cater for female sport, and that's unisex toilets, change rooms, etc., etc. And I'm currently involved in East Ringwood, and we've been really fortunate that our club rooms have just been knocked down, but the reason for that is that we've got girls teams in most age groups.
Fantastic.
And it's just growing. And what it's doing is it's growing your club. And like we really talk heavily here about the AFLW, and we think that it's probably still that, not quite the poor cousin, but there's still things that need to be done to get it going where it has to.
Yeah.
And obviously, love to see a Melbourne flag there as well. But
they've got to be a chance.
Well, yesterday against Fremantle, I felt sorry for Freo. But you look at the effort that you guys put in to get players like Daisy Pearce. Judge mentioned Debbie Lee, Susan Delberto. You could go through a whole list of people and the impact that they've had on the sport and for the greater good. So I love Taylor Harris. I think that she's everything great about our game. The high marking, she loves to hit a pack hard.
Power, just the power.
And she's a beautiful kick. So all of a sudden, you've got these young girls watching her play and go, well, do you know what? I want to be like Taylor Harris.
Yeah, there's just the whole, it's still got a long way to go. So I'm not saying it's the perfect scenario, but we're still working out the men's comp after like 160 years. So the chances are we're still going to be working out the others. And yes, equality will come into it, all of these important conversations. But even the fact that we're having those conversations now is something that we hadn't, if we went back 10 years, we wouldn't dream to be where we are now, particularly having gone through what we've gone through over the last couple of years. So it is, it's one thing having, the vision, but it really was the work of your Debbie Lees for generations before. And the same thing's happening in women's sport across the world. Like in the UK, women's football was banned for about 40 years, like banned from playing because it was seen as not being good for women or somebody, after the war. And actually it was during the war, because all the men were away, that the women actually kept playing and were getting the history of it. They were getting big crowds to their games during the war because the men were all at war. So then straight after the war, they're banned from playing. It was just crazy stuff which actually happened. But the opportunity we've now got is to actually, in all honesty, say that regardless of who you are, you can find a career for yourself in the game. And that's something that football sort of pretended that it offered, but it really didn't, and now it does. And so I think from that perspective, whilst it will look different as time goes on and what the good, right mix is and all that's going to take a fair bit of sorting out. But gee, it's a wonderful opportunity for everyone in the game.
Absolutely. And Paul's NRL, and today they've got a triple header, and you're starting to see the impact that had. Last week was played at Newcastle and they got a big crowd, and you could actually tell on TV how much it meant to everyone.
Yeah.
And like you said, it's baby steps. You put things in place, and next year we're going to have all 18 clubs in the AFL will have a female team.
Fantastic.
Yeah. And you're not using the word token. You're not using those sorts of words to say, well, they're doing it because they've got to do it. They're doing it because they actually want to.
Yeah.
And as I said, I think the AFLW, and my nephews are 11 and 9. The first player that Oliver, who's the youngest, was Daisy Pearce.
Was it? Fantastic.
Yeah.
She'll end up coaching AFL footy, I reckon, Daisy Pearce.
And she's a wonderful person for AFLW. Ignore AFLWM, W, whatever you want to say. She's football.
Yeah. It's no coincidence that they basically give her a microphone in a serious sense, only part of the way through last year. She'd done other stuff, I get that. But then 1 year, 6 months later, you're the number one special comments. Why? Because you give us insight. And that's actually something which I think most people underestimate that they want from their commentators. I don't want to know about what school they went to and all that sort of stuff. And I want to find out something that I otherwise didn't know. So that is, and Daisy Pearce does it, and you can she sees the game, and it's interesting because she was often on the boundary seeing the game that way, where it's actually when you're above, you see the game differently. But she would actually, her on the spot comments, probably because she's, current play where she sees spaces where, it looks easy from the grandstand. She's a wonderful person.
Well, I'm glad she wasn't hooked up grand final day, because the Western Bulldogs may have made that correction to the front of the centre square, because she identified that extremely early and nothing changed. So
we sometimes would have people listening, actually.
Yeah, well, I'm glad they weren't that darkish.
They did, but then you could do something about it.
Yeah.
Like, it's one thing having the knowledge, then actually working out what you do about it. I've been in many coaches' box where they know exactly what's going wrong. They haven't got the chess pieces, to actually do anything with it.
So, Cameron, obviously with the AFLW, we've gone from an exhibition match, as you said, 2013. To where we are now. We've got matches this round. We've got a 9-round season, and then we've got finals.
Yeah.
When do you if you put your hat on, when do you actually think that it goes to alignment with the AFL? So you've got a full 22-round season plus finals.
Yeah.
And then obviously from that, it becomes the next step, and it might be the same time, I don't know. It becomes a professional sport.
I think the interesting thing is it could become a professional sport before it does the other.
Yeah.
Which is interesting, because that's sort of counterintuitive in some ways. But it's not like... See, the evolution of the AFL was that we put on games, people would pay money to come and watch the games. And that's, therefore, as that got bigger, we could pay the players more. And generally, the game's been going broke ever since, in one way or another, because we always want to pay more than what the game can actually earn. But what's happened with the women's game is that its value isn't in... The value is in part people coming and watching it, no doubt, because it'll always be that. But it's actually what it brings to the game in all other respects, like the stuff that we talked about, that you can now go to your council and say, look, we're rebuilding our rooms. Can we get a couple of $1 million to help our facilities here? So you're not measuring it in the same way as you've always measured it, is what I'm saying. It's measured in... It's just not... People will look at all the obvious metrics, and the old story, if it's too obvious, it can't be trusted, generally, as a rule. And so people look at the obvious metrics and say, well, how many people are watching the games or watching it on the television? Well, that's not the metric in this case. It's actually, now, what does it mean in the context of the community? What does it mean in the identity? What does it mean in terms of people loving the game from this point onwards, regardless, that it is, and that's why I think of it as one of the biggest things that's ever happened, because it has changed that metric. It has changed that idea. And so I would say that it will be able to justify the next, and even... I mean, there are obviously some very well-paid players in the AFL, but there is a lot of players who are professionally, who are got no choice but to be professional AFL players, because the game demands that, who certainly aren't earning a salary which is going to set them up for the rest of their lives. They're earning a decent salary for this period of their lives, but they're also setting aside a lot of their other growth, earning, development, phases of their life. So they're often at maybe 24, 25, having to start out where all their mates did stuff earlier. So that's always a bit of a challenge, but that's the same for anyone pursuing something other than what you would call a normal career path.
That's one of the biggest challenges the AFL has faced over the years, is that players are put into a system and spat out. And I think the average...
They're not spat out.
I wouldn't say spat out, but it's 35.
They're parachuted out, which is a much different scenario, as in that they're... The one thing which I think's changed a little bit is, for those who are knowledgeable of it, they recognise that the environment that an AFL player is in is a very high learning environment for them. They learn a lot about life. They miss out on some other critical learnings, no doubt about that. They learn about struggle, but a different form of struggle than having to put yourself through uni and work as a waiter or whatever it might be. It's a different form of struggle. But I know, having now my kids are now mature, I know that, say, if they'd had the opportunity to have some of the development that AFL football actually would have given them, and you got to remember, for the men, not so much for the girls, but for the boys, we recruit the most selfish human beings known to mankind, called the 18-year-old male. And then the very first thing we've got to educate them on is selflessness. And if you can't learn selflessness, you can't survive this system. Well, that's something that most men don't learn for much later in life. Really, we're not very good at that. So that's sort of genetically, human nature puts us back into the selfish really quite quickly, And so there's a wonderful education they're going through. There's a young guy who's come out of Melbourne, Neville Jetta. He'd be one of the best young blokes in the world,
Lord Nev, he's loved by the fans. He's loved universally. And he got the list. Like, you go through it, and it's such an amazing story, Cam. And outside the club as a player, he may have just been a sort of a so-so. But I'll tell you, loved. Absolutely loved.
He's actually very talented as well. So he just wasn't. In the end, his timing wasn't quite right, was it? He just needed to be a little bit, probably 2 years younger. But I just see the growth of a fella like him as an example, and he's embraced all aspects of it. And he would have always been someone pretty special. And his father was stolen generation. When he talks openly about that, there's just a lot of stories that he can tell. And it's then no coincidence that really come the end of his career, that's almost like a conga line of people wanting to employ him in their own way. So if we can then create an environment where more and more the respect for this aspect of a person's growth is really respected, yes, they mightn't have the same, they mightn't have been able to do some of the other work stuff, but they'll catch up pretty quick. And, so I would have no, there's a young guy who missed out at Melbourne, who is one of the best young blokes I've ever met in footy, is Jack Grimes. And just the body just didn't hold together for him, and things didn't. Jack Train gave another one. They're two of the best young blokes I've ever met in footy. And like, if I had to say, here are the best 10 people you've met in footy over 30 years, well, they'd be close to being in the best in that top 10, And so, and the game just wasn't fair to them, in its own way. And they're sort of seen as almost, but they'd be waking up every morning thinking what could have been in their own way. But part of who they are is because of that they've had to work through disappointments. They've had to work through. So I look at what Dylan's achieved at Richmond and know how good Jack was compared with what Dylan was, If he just got the same, and it looked like Dylan was going to go down the same track for a little while. But how good Jack Grimes could have been if he just got a normal run of development through. He would have got his kicking right. He would have got all that. He's kicking one quite right early and all those sorts of things. Because players of his aptitude, they do get it right, they do grow. And so what I think the reason I just sort of pull Jap a little bit on that is that there is very good systems trying to help these people be the best they can be, beyond the game. But it is also the competition sets a very high standard, and not everyone's going to reach that standard. And it's called elite sport for a reason. So, therefore, it's going to some people aren't going to make it, but I know in the main, because of the growth that comes from inside them, I know personally, for the shit days you went through, I know that there was an upside to that, if you know what I mean. There's lots of days I wish I didn't have to go through it, but there's no doubt that as part of who I am now, is because I've woken up in the morning and gone, oh Christ, I've got to deal with this today,
But you raise a point, and it like, you do look at it, and it is a brutal industry, but I think that we would all agree that we've got the best sport in the world, like hands down, and the women's footy is just confirming that more and more as well.
Yeah, no, we're very lucky. It's a weird old sport. You couldn't invent it if you started, but it's a weird old sport. Yeah.
All right, Cam, listen, thanks for spending some more time with us. We really appreciate it. Just one quick one before you go. No doubt Dalesford Footy Club's approached you to take on some role there, surely.
No, I'm just a really good supporter. The Bulldogs, they used to be the Demons, actually. They're now the Bulldogs when they came back into this league. No, there's a guy, Carson White, who's their president, who I know well. So I'm all care, no responsibility. That would be my approach.
Smart man, Professor Smart man, I can assure you.
Yeah, I just know that running the only difference between what he had to do and what I had to do was that we had put more noughts on our checks, basically. That's the only fundamental difference. But
all right, thanks, Cam. Much appreciated as always, and we'll look forward to catching up with you again soon.
Good on you. Keep up the good work, guys. Keep loving the game.
Cheers. All right, Paul. NRLW last week. There were more collisions there than I've seen for quite some time, and some pretty nasty injuries. Yeah,
it's not great. Look at all of those parliaments you see over in Europe there, where they all lay on in and get stuck into each other. But that was pretty rough and tumble for the ladies. But they're tough, and it's a short season, so hopefully they can hold it all together for what's to come. We have the Broncos favourites. They've won the last three, so they're looking good for another title. But we'll see what happens. Still keeping an eye out, though, on our girl Jess. Don't be a mess back, Jess. We want her to crash over today to score a try. It would be nice. That's on later this afternoon, that match at 1:50 p.m. for the listeners. So the Roosters and remember the Titans at 1:50 p.m.
So, Paul, you were 1 from 3 last week. You missed on the Broncos and the Gold Coast. Knights and Broncos at midday today. Who's going to win that one?
Well, I don't have to be Nostradamus or pull that octopus that tip things. It's already over the game pretty much. So I'll go with the Broncos, Professor. And it's a shame you can't pat me on the back through the Zoom there, because the game's already done. They're good on the Knights already. So maybe we'll just focus on the other two. Roosters to score with our girl Jess to barge over the line. And in the later game, I think the Dragons have something to offer against the Eels. Did you want me to launch into my season preview like an auctioneer?
Yeah, just shortly. I just wanted to go through with you. I was talking about the big hits. So I had a look at the injury roll. We had what looked like a fractured cheekbone, and it wasn't. Then we had a fractured cheekbone. We had a broken nose, and we had 2 concussions. That's what happened from those big hits. Are you surprised at those injuries, or will they steady out as the season goes on?
No, it made Once for Warriors look like a sit down with the Dalai Lama. I tell you what, it was pretty willing out there, and I think it was just game one of the season. The ladies wanted to show pent up aggression, like a lot of us probably have, wanting just to let out a bit of steam. So I think it won't get as bad, and they'll start taking some action if there's anything reckless, which is what happened in the men's game, of course, when they brought some real changes in.
All right, the much awaited 2022 season preview. Off you go.
How long have I got? Do I have to be like one of those cow auctioneers in America? 87, 87.
No, you go. You've got time.
Is Cameron still talking? I think the hind leg's off the donkey. Anyway, I'll get it. It's off the donkey. Go on. All right, we'll kick it off at the bottom. Why don't we do that? Speaking of cattle auctioneers, the Cowboys, no good. And won't be any better. They recruited barely anyone in the off-season. So Valentine Holmes, I have a dream, Jared Haynes style. Well, he's got out of the big house, Jared Haynes. That's positive for him. But Valentine Holmes was another NFL aspirant who didn't make it over there, and he didn't make it in the Cowboys fullback slot. They've recruited terribly. They will come last. Second last will be the Tigers with their leader, the man with the F-bombs, Michael Maguire. I just don't like their lineup. I don't think they've got enough spark to take on the better teams this year. Tim Sheens is back doing the overseeing type role. They'll need a bit more than an overseeing type role in a kitchen with those chefs. They have got back Jackson Hastings, which would be quite a rehabilitation story. He was sent over to Europe with some issues, got his game in order, has come back with rave reviews, but there's just not enough in that Tigers team to bother the better sides. Our friend, regular listener, Kevin Yap, he won't like this, but I've got the Dragons coming 14th, so there'll be some inevitable messages from him when they start winning a few matches. But they've lost quite a few players. Weekend at Hornies left, of course. Don't be a nufty. Back Matt Duffy went to your Dogs. I just don't think that they've got enough there to trouble the better teams. Yes, they look good in the Charity Shield against the Rabbitohs, but I have those Dragons, sorry, to our friend at 14. The Warriors have got about 4 halves. They've got to fit into 2 slots. I don't know why they went out and recruited so many. I just don't think that they're going to challenge the top sides. I've got them at 13. There's just some issues there. They've also, it's not their fault at all, but they've got another year in a bubble. Like Howard Hughes spent less time in a bubble, I think, than the Warriors. And so they're going to be here again in their Aussie bubble, which isn't fair on them, but it will affect, unfortunately, their performance. The Raiders are an interesting one. I don't have them finishing any higher than 12th. They've got some competition at fullback. There's a guy called Xavier Savage, which I want you to keep an eye on this year. There's another Xavier I'll get to shortly who I think will win our equivalent of the Dally M. The Brownlow, which is the Dally M. I think the Raiders will be okay. The query is number 7, Jamal Fogarty. So he's a Titans cast-off. Jack Whiten at 6. I just think there's some spark there. We're getting up into the better sides, but they're not going to quite get there. All the talk in the year about the Broncos, whether they're going to be any good this year. They have certainly recruited well in the sadly departed Adam Reynolds from the Rabbitohs. He was our Napoleon, and we talked about this, Professor, regularly. You don't put Napoleon on a battle-by-battle deal. I was stunned that my Rabbitohs let Adam Reynolds go, but I just don't quite think he'll be enough to get the Broncos up into the top 8. There is a guy there I want you to watch, Selwyn Cobbo at the back. He's a cross between Greg Inglis and Latrell Mitchell. He'll score a lot of tries, but I'm just a bit worried if I was a Broncos fan. Albert Kelly at 6. He makes a 6-year-old with ADHD look predictable. So I don't know what they're going to get from Albert Kelly there at 6. I know you wanted some questions as I went along. You or Coutta, anyone, on what I've served up so far? This is in the bottom section of the league. I don't think any of those teams are going to do much.
I think one of the issues, Paul, that we've got, or those teams have got, is a lack of depth. And you mentioned the Raiders. They're already missing players. Like Fogarty's going to miss a significant part of the season. So all of a sudden, the Raiders that have been around that mark, playing finals the last few years, I don't think their depth will allow them to play finals this year, and I think you're probably on the mark with them.
And we'll get to it, but it touches on 2 things. You saying, Coutta, you've got the best sport. I'll leave that to one side. I think we've got the most brutal sport, and that's where the cover for injuries comes in. And I don't want to get to it yet, but that's where the Storm are going to miss Nico Hines, who stepped in seamlessly. Those teams, all those teams I've mentioned, don't have a great squad to start with. So let alone the nature of the horrific injuries which Professor touched on, which will happen in the game because it's getting faster, the players are getting bigger, and there's going to be more injuries. So those teams don't have a great start of a squad, let alone when injuries strike. Teams that are a little bit higher, the Knights. Kalen Ponga is one of the more interesting players in the league. He made a very interesting statement about not committing further to the Knights. The All Blacks would probably pay him upwards towards $2 million a year. I'm not exaggerating that. He's that good. As would our man Wayne Bennett up there at the Dolphins. So anything could happen up there. If he goes there, he would be their marquee signing that Wayne Bennett's after. So we'll see what happens with the Knights. I just think with the loss of Mitchell Pearce, again, we talk about the halves. Mitchell Pearce is going to be a massive loss. He was their club's spiritual leader. So we'll see what happens there at the Knights. I just don't quite have them into the 8. And Professor, I'm sorry to do this, but I'm a straight shooter, if nothing else. Probably won't shock you too much. Your Dogs just not quite into the 8 this year, I don't think. It almost is like one of those Champions League sides in Europe where they throw all these superstars together and hope for instant chemistry. There's an amazing array of talent there. You've got Duffy at the back, quick. You've got Burton at 6, who's got probably the most pressure of any player in the game on his shoulders this year. You've got Pangai Jr., superstar of the forward. But your number 7, I don't think they even know yet who's playing 7. And we're 1 week out from the season. You've got Brandon Wakeham and Jake Avarillo, neither of whom are going to get people to rush out and sign up for KO Sports to make sure they don't miss the Dogs match. So there's your lack of depth, Professor. I'd love you to make the 8. It would be quite a story after last year, but I just don't quite think you'll get there. Any questions on that, gents?
I've got a question on the Bulldogs. 10 new players. You didn't mention Addo Carr. He'd give them a bit of speed from the back, wouldn't he?
Well, he will. I was about to say that as part of the Storm wrap-up, in that he's the sort of player you just can't afford to lose. But with that sort of production, you need him to be fed the ball. So if these halves aren't performing, it doesn't matter if you've got Carl Lewis or whoever out there on the wing. If he's not getting the ball enough, he won't be a superstar that he was. I could have scored some tries on the back of that Storm backline that he played with. It's the amount of space and time he was given. I'm not talking him down at all. It's just he needs the supply, the same as a gun full forward in the AFL. If you're not getting them the ball, there's not much they're going to be able to do. So sadly, I think his production will drop off this year just by giving the 6s and 7s who have to get in the ball and the centres around him.
How much pressure is Trent Barrett under?
Enormous pressure, enormous. Hot seat would be very high on him, as it would be on each of the teams that I've mentioned below him. Enormous pressure, but they're the ones, probably the biggest off-season recruiting drive I've seen in my life. So if he doesn't make it work, and it's quite an irony actually. I think he was the defensive coach, wasn't it once? So no, he's the attacking coach. That's showing actually, because his defence isn't great. They're going to have too many points put on them, and they won't score enough to cover for it.
But isn't he an interesting one? As in, he's been headhunted to come in to coach the Bulldogs. He's been given, or him and Slug Gould have been given access to go and chase players. So, what is a pass mark for 2022, Paul, for the Bulldogs, for him to keep his job? But then, is it longer term? Like, have they set a limit or what they will take? So, is it finals this year, then next year's top 4? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Oh, Phil Gould, he loves a goal more than Anthony Robbins. He'd have a list there of a 5-year plan or a 3-year plan. He did have a plan at the Panthers that everyone laughed about, and he left and it came true. Unfortunately for Barrett, I think what he's done, he's coming off the back of Cleary and an amazing team, so he's looked pretty good as an assistant. The same way Michael Maguire inherited an amazing Rabbitohs team. Yes, it was a good coaching effort, but I think that he shone a bit brightly out of that, and that's why he was punted not long after. If we get into the 8 now, I do have the Titans making the 8, and we would love that to happen because we do want a team working on the Gold Coast. They've got some interesting players there. They've got Jaden Campbell at the back. AJ Brimson has moved into the 6th role. He's going to be one of the first pick for the Queensland State of Origin team. Very exciting player. Guy called Toby Sexton, you might not have heard of, but you'll hear a lot more of this year, number 7. That is a pretty unknown 6 and 7 to make the 8. But with guys like David Fafita there, who's the human wrecking ball, I haven't seen someone more destructive since Miley Cyrus swung on that wrecking ball. So I just think he's going to have a superstar season for Fafita if they can keep him fit. And as always on the Gold Coast, keep their mind on the job and not on the beach. That's the challenge always up there. The Sharks, they've added players galore there. I went to the Storm launch during the week and met Robbie Kearns, had a good chat about Fitzgibbon. He's an amazingly disciplined coach. He calls him one of his better mates, and he says, I can catch up with you, mate. It'll have to be between 6 and 7 on a Sunday. And that's AM. That's how driven Craig Fitzgibbon is, having a coffee with his mate. He schedules it in at 6 a.m. on a Sunday morning. So you can see how much work Fitzgibbon's putting in. If you can keep Nico Hines out of the nightclubs in the Shire, because he's a pretty sharp-looking rooster, Nico, I think that the Sharks might just do okay. They've added an amazing amount of players there. And I think...
With Nico Hines, he plays in the 6, doesn't he, this year?
He will, yes. So he fitted seamlessly into the Storm, and we'll get to them shortly. But I just think he's the sort of player that can do anything. He'll have a great coach there. The player that Craig Bellamy said he never wanted to lose out of any player he'd ever played with was Finucane. And at the Storm launch, you could tell the way that he felt about losing Dale Finucane. He's moving to the part of the Sydney where I grew up. You could easily raise a family there, put in 5 years. You can simply see the dramas and problems that the Storm are always going to have is keeping someone who's not from Melbourne there when they're wanting a 3, 4, 5 year deal. He's looking at you, Jerome Hughes, who almost certainly will go up to Wayne Bennett at the Dolphins. The reason is, who doesn't want to be living at Moreton Bay on nearly $1 million a year when you're guaranteed a 5 year deal? You've got a young family. So that's what's going to plague the Storm, unfortunately, into eternity. It's a great city, Melbourne. We love it. But keeping rugby league players in Melbourne and more importantly, under the salary cap is the Storm's issue. Finucane was getting on a bit. They've lost the Bromwich brothers as well to the Dolphins. They just can't keep them all, unfortunately. So that's the Sharks going to be interesting to watch. I wouldn't be surprised if they finish higher. But again, it's that throwing everyone together and expecting magic, which might affect them.
Looks like the professor's gone.
Have we cut out?
Yeah, he lost the feed. So what's he saying here? Start again. Sorry, 1 second. So I think we need to exit, Paul. I think we need to leave.